To Meet the Press now, I'm Gabe Gutierrez in a very snowy Washington that's all but shut down, except for Congress, which met today to certify President-elect Trump's election victory as he returns to power 4 years after rioters stormed the Capitol in an attempt to keep him in power. Unlike January 6, 2021, today's proceedings in a joint session of Congress were a peaceful and normal bureaucratic and ceremonial exercise, with Vice President Harris presiding over her electoral defeat with no objections from either chamber to the electoral count. Here's the moment of certification from the House floor.
Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes.
Of course, that's a major contrast to the atmosphere in Washington 4 years ago when the former president riled up his supporters with a speech on the White House ellipse, urging them to march to the Capitol to fight like hell, which some did. According to aides who testified to the January 6th committee, Trump watched the turmoil unfold on television, rejecting pleas to call off the mob, waiting hours before finally telling them to go home. With Trump now returning to the White House, President Biden is urging Americans not to forget or whitewash that day. Here's what he told reporters last night.
4 years ago, January 6th, this Capitol was attacked by a violent mob. If you come over to the Oval before I leave, I'll show you the room that the former president sat in for 3.5 hours watching what was going on television, the small dining room off the Oval Office. And our democracy is really literally put to the test. And thankfully, our democracy held. Now it's your duty to tell the truth, to remember what happened, and not let January 6th be rewritten or even erased. To honor the Constitution, not only the most extraordinary of days, but it's one of the toughest days in American history, January 6th.
In contrast, President-elect Trump has sought to absolve himself of all blame for the attack on the Capitol, going as far as to call January 6th a day of love. He's also promising pardons on his first day in office to defendants accused or convicted of crimes related to January 6th. NBC News obtained a letter from former Proud Boys leader
as well, with officers from as far away as New York City here to supplement the Capitol Police and the security that they have been planning for essentially around this moment for years. Inside the chamber, you got a little glimpse of it in your open there, part celebratory when each candidate or each party was able to cheer their candidate claiming a certain state along the way. And I think a little bit of Democratic side, a little bit of kind of ruining what could have been and what was in that chamber. You heard a little bit of dampened enthusiasm from the Democrats, certainly compared to Republicans. And there was that one awkward moment where the vice president announced Donald Trump's vote total of 312. A huge cheer from Republicans. She just had to sort of wait a minute to announce her own vote total. I think a moment of reflection for Democrats about what might have been 4 years ago and what might have been this November to now.
Yeah, Gary, let's pick up on that. As we saw, the vice president presided over that certification. And that's the same role, of course, that Vice President Mike Pence played as rioters called for him to be hung 4 years ago. Even after losing the election, how does Harris view her role today?
Well, it was interesting. The vice president tried on her way into the chamber, in a brief comment to me, I think, to downplay her role and play up the role of the American people, much like President Biden did in the remarks you just played, suggesting that, it's up to the people to withhold democracy. Afterwards, she spoke very briefly to reporters and suggested she was doing her constitutional duty and that, yes, this is now on us. Listen to what she said when this was all over today.
Today, I did what I have done my entire career, which is take seriously the oath that I have taken many times to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, which included today performing my constitutional duties to ensure that the people of America, the voters of America, will have their vote.
Leader Enrique Tarrio, who's serving 22 years in federal prison after being convicted of seditious conspiracy, requesting a pardon from Trump. On Meet the Press yesterday, the new Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, who back in 2021 called the attack on the Capitol, quote, thuggery and inexcusable, deferred to the president-elect on the matter of pardons.
That's ultimately going to be a decision that President Trump is going to have to make. And, what I'm focused on is the future and not looking in the rearview mirror, but looking at the windshield and what we have to do. I think you learn from the past, you remember the past, but you live in the present and the future. As the majority leader in the Senate, though, what message do you think it would send to give pardons to people who pleaded guilty to attacking police officers who stormed this building 4 years ago? Well, look, again, it's ultimately going to be a decision that the President of the United States, the pardon authority exists with him.
And with me now is our team of reporters, NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haake, NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Riley, and NBC News reporter Gary Grumbach. Thank you all so much for joining me. Garrett, I want to start with you. Take us inside the chamber. What was the mood like as Congress certified the election under that cloud of January 6th 4 years ago?
Yeah, I think the memory of what happened here 4 years ago was still present, Gabe, in part because of the layers of security members had to go through just to get into the chamber. The fence is back up outside the Capitol, something that didn't exist 4 years ago, but that was constructed after the fact. There was an enormous police presence here inside the complex.
Votes counted. America's democracy is only as strong as our willingness to fight for it. Every single person, their willingness to fight for and respect the importance of our democracy. Otherwise, it is very fragile and it will not be able to withstand moments of crisis. And today, America's democracy stood.
So, Gabe, I don't know about you, but I hear in that an effort to kind of destigmatize the events of this day, turn it back into what was basically a pro forma exercise in certifying the election results, but also to remind people, again, to remind the citizenry that this is on us, not on a Mike Pence or a Kamala Harris or anybody in elected office to be a bulwark to protect democracy. It's on the citizenry.
Well, Garrett, moving past January 6th and after today, House and Senate Republicans will now have to focus on actually legislating. So what's that going to look like and how complicated will that be given Speaker Johnson's narrow majority in the House?
I think it's going to be exceptionally complicated, Gabe. I think perhaps more complicated than congressional Republicans have been willing to grapple with. I don't know how closely they were watching what Democrats went through over the last 4 years and their efforts to pass bills through reconciliation, that party line process, how complex it was for President Biden, who had a larger majority in the House, albeit a smaller one in the Senate. Now it's going to be House Republicans who will have to go first here, either with one bill, which seems to be Donald Trump's preference, or splitting up their agenda into multiple parts. They can afford between now and April no defections of any kind. If you've been watching the House Republicans for the last 2 years, you know how unlikely that's going to be, especially considering how complex border, energy, taxes, these issues are that they'll be grappling with. But that work really starts in earnest this coming weekend with House Republicans in groups traveling to Mar-a-Lago to meet with the president-elect and try to hash out exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to try to get it done early in this new year.
Complex indeed. Garrett Haake live for us on Capitol Hill. Garrett, thank you. And I want to turn now to Ryan Riley. Ryan, it's been 4 years since the attack on the Capitol. And where do DOJ's prosecutions stand today?
Yeah, so there's been over 1,250 people who have been convicted in connection with the January 6th attack on the Capitol. More than 1,500 people have been charged. More than 600 people have been sentenced to periods of incarceration. But today, the number of people who are actually behind bars is much smaller. So effectively what you have is the possibility that if Donald Trump ends up pardoning some people, that he could pardon 700 people and it would have no practical impact on anyone being, on anything really, because there are 700 people who have already completed their sentences or never got any sentence of incarceration to begin with. So those indicators would basically erase that. If he pardoned 700 people, that would erase those charges, but it wouldn't have really much of a practical impact on anyone, except if there are any felons in there who might have their voting rights or their gun rights restored. So there are just 700 cases sitting out there that he could theoretically pardon if he wanted to get a big number that wouldn't actually have any practical impact in any real terms. It wouldn't as though they would be opening up the federal prisons across the country and letting folks out. That's just people who are already completed their sentence or were never sentenced to jail or prison to begin with.
And a little earlier, we heard Kristen ask Senator Thune about this, but what do we know about President-elect Trump's plan to pardon people who've been charged?
Yeah, so I've been talking to a bunch of the January 6th lawyers about this, and what's clear is that there's really no structure in place for any of this. And I think the category of people who are talking to Trump about this is pretty small. He's obviously got a lot on his plate right now. There's a whole government to set up, so this might not necessarily be the priority, but he's made clear that he wants to send a message about this in the coming days. So I think those 700 could be, maybe something to look at, because that would certainly convince a lot of his supporters that he cared a lot about this, but it actually wouldn't have that much of a practical impact, and any backlash on him wouldn't really be much, because there wouldn't really be that much of an impact, practically speaking. It would just be sending a signal, basically saying that you're pardoning these 700 people. Of course, in the mix there, and
both enacted protections for immigrants in response to Trump's focus on enforcement during his first administration, and those who more stringent law affecting immigrants, such as Florida. Conical Students for a Dream, an advocacy group of undocumented youth, recently held a session in the city of Danbury, which is home to immigrants from Ecuador, the Dominican Republic, and everywhere. Organizers advise that you don't have to speak with immigration agents if they knock on your door, and warned in a Facebook post, if you choose to speak, remember not to lie. Advocates are also urging those who are eligible to complete application for U.S. citizenship or other immigrants benefits before next year, aiming to avoid potentially lengthy wait times under an incoming administration that seems focused on immigration enforcement rather than integration. The Florida Immigration Coalition is offering free clinics to those help of immigrants who may have a pathway to a legal status and can afford a layer inside already busy immigration court in Chicago. National Immigrants Justice Center attorneys who help run a legal help desk said said they are trying to resolve as many cases as possible before Trump take office. It feels a little different because we have a clear expectation of what is coming, said Lisa Cook,